Barbers in the Middle Ages were the ultimate multitaskers. While it's true that a lot of surgery in the Middle Ages was done by so-called barber surgeons, these precursors to the old dude with combs and a jar of blue water did a whole lot more than just cut people open. So, today we're going to take a look at the bizarre and bloody practices of medieval barbers. Okay, prepare yourself for a close shave with history. Perhaps the best description of medieval barbers comes from an inscription on a 16th century woodcut by German artist Jost de Man, presented in the first person from a man practicing the trade. I am called everywhere. I can make many healing salves. I can cure new wounds, also fractures and chronic afflictions, syphilis, cataract, gangrene, pull teeth, shave, wash, and cut hair. I also like to bleed. While it may sound like the worst Tinder profile ever written, it's not wrong. Medieval barbers did all that stuff, and they were considered the experts, although some, if not most of their methods, were a little questionable. For example, once upon a time, medieval barbers used to pour boiling oil into gunshot wounds in order to cauterize them, which sounds a bit like driving your car into a lake because the check engine light came on. Then one day, a famous French barber surgeon named Ambroise Paré realized how unhelpful boiling oil was as far as treating wounds. How did he make that discovery? Well, at the Battle of Turin in 1536, Paré ran out of oil and was forced to improvise. He instead threw together a salve made with some egg yolks, because he had them, oil of roses, possibly for the smell, and turpentine, because at that point he was just grabbing whatever. After a sleepless night on the battlefield, Paré awoke to discover that his salve, slapped together as it was, worked a whole lot better than the boiling oil. Although, to be honest, anything other than a second bullet would have felt better in a gunshot wound. According to Paré, he visited with all of his patients, and he discovered that everyone who had been treated with his weirdo salve, counter to his expectations, fared better than those who had traditional boiling oil. He wrote that each patient he treated with salve had a good rest, and that their wounds were not inflamed or tumefied. On the other hand, those that had been treated with standard boiling oil were feverish, tormented with much pain, and the parts about their wounds were swollen. You know, like a person who had been doused with boiling oil. After repeating the procedure on diverse others, Paré concluded that neither he nor any other should ever cauterize any wounded with gunshot. Paré went on to advocate that medical practitioners should treat wounds gently, an innovation that of course survives to this day, although I'm pretty sure that doesn't include turpentine and egg yolks anymore. Barbers performing minor surgeries in the Middle Ages sometimes offered anesthetic in the form of something called a soporific sponge. It was like a primitive form of chloroform, made by soaking a sea sponge in a mix containing ingredients such as hemlock, mandrake, ivy, hyoscyamine, mulberry juice, and opium, among others. I'm no doctor or even a medieval barber, but it sounds like maybe the opium is doing the heavy lifting there. Also, pretty sure hemlock is poisonous, but hey, it's a party. The sponge is supposed to be completely dried out in the sun during the dog days until all the liquid is consumed. When the barber needed to knock someone out, they reconstituted the sponge by dipping it in water and then placing it under the patient's nose. Some historians have suggested that the sponge contents were meant to be imbibed, which would have been a very stiff drink. Get it? Stiff? Because it'd probably kill you? Okay. Pass the sponge. Instead of university-educated physicians, lowly barbers in the Middle Ages were tasked with removing kidney stones. And they often did it with an audience watching, which adds a real weekday matinee vibe to the term operating theater. Traveling from town to town with a special lithotomy table in tow, talented barbers would perform the simple procedure in just a few minutes, in public, in order to help advertise their services. Some barbers were just showmen looking to make a quick buck. These so-called stonecutters, that's a hell of an image, were heavily fined if their procedure didn't go according to plan. After all, you couldn't just have anyone with zero medical training performing surgery in public. Bloodletting and the related practice of leeching are what most people associate with archaic medieval medicine. And the association holds up. Medieval folks undeniably loved a good bloodletting. But did you know that medieval people thought that bloodletting was a cure-all that would fix pretty much anything and everything? That's the reason barbers practiced bloodletting more than anything else. As far as they knew, there was nothing it couldn't make right. It was like Robitussin, if Robitussin stabbed you in a major artery. One medieval medical textbook even boasted, "Bloodletting clears the mind, strengthens the memory, cleanses the gut, dries up the brain, warms the marrow, sharpens the hearing, curbs tears, promotes digestion, produces a musical voice, dispels sleeplessness, drives away anxiety, feeds the blood, rids it of poisonous matter, and gives long life. That sounds pretty good. I'm in. The book also claims bloodletting cures pains, fevers, and various sicknesses, and makes the urine clear and clean, which is how I think everybody likes urine. Of course, in reality, bloodletting doesn't do any of these things, and it can even prove fatal, which Weird History fans who saw the episode about the death and attempted resurrection of George Washington know a little something about. But its complete ineffectiveness as a treatment didn't stop some physicians from recommending it for the treatment of pneumonia as late as 1942. That's right. Some doctors were still prescribing a good old-fashioned bloodletting the year Bambi came out in theaters. Medieval barbers looking to advertise their superior bloodletting skills channeled their inner Don Drapers, and by placing bowls of human blood in their shop windows. While the blood bowls may have brought in new business from stray dogs and supernatural creatures, the people of London didn't respond to them so well. The blood would congeal and get putrid, causing the disgusted citizenry to push for a law banning the questionable displays. The law was passed in 1307 with the following wording: "No barber shall be so bold or so hardy as to put blood in their windows." I'm not sure, but I think that's medieval sarcasm. The barbers were a bit miffed by the public outcry. For them, the displays were a handy way of recycling unwanted blood. And if they couldn't use it for promotional purposes, what were they supposed to do with the blood? Throw it away? Actually, yes. Lawmakers, ever concerned about public health and sanitation, advised barbers to throw their old bowls of blood into the River Thames instead. Further proof that the Thames has literally never been safe to swim in. So how did barbers advertise after the Great Blood Bowl ban of 1307? Some historians believe this is when the practice of wrapping a bloody cloth around a pole outside the shop began, a grisly precursor to the wholesome image of a modern-day barber pole. Believe it or not, human urine has its uses as a cleaning agent, even though you're probably not going to see it on the shelf of Target anytime soon. The Romans knew it. In fact, they even recycled their urine to help get their togas cleaner. And it worked. Truly, ammonia does wonders. Barbers in the Middle Ages knew it too, and even used stale urine, known as iotonium, as a shampoo for their clients. That's cool. Whether you could bring your own locally sourced pee from home is still a matter of historical debate. No doubt some of you are wondering if washing your hair with old pee is a workable life hack for saving money on shampoo. Well, some modern folks have given it a try. And the general word is that while rinsing your hair with urine will keep it silky and shiny, the whole procedure still makes your head smell like pee. A document from 1499 detailing the affairs of the Guild of Barbers of Oxford mentions alebasters, an obscure term that initially stumped the editors of the tome Records of Medieval Oxford. Subsequent research, however, revealed that the lowest class of medieval barbers simply couldn't afford a plentiful supply of shaving soap, so they sometimes turned to froth of ale for basting their patients' faces instead. Yeah, they used beer foam as shaving cream, for when you're looking to give your face that bar rag freshness. Why Axe, Old Spice, or even Anheuser-Busch haven't resurrected this trend is yet another of history's mysteries. Now grab that Michelob and get a good lather going. A lot of medieval barbers doubled as chandlers. Could they be any more medieval? Sadly, however, this had nothing to do with 90s sitcoms. In this sense, a chandler was just another name for a candle maker. Why did barbers make candles? Well, chandlers and barbers both used a ton of wax. Barbers used it as a base in ointments, and chandlers obviously had a great need for it in their candle making. Sometimes barbers practiced a strange procedure where they would treat a patient by using wax to make a model of their diseased organs. They would then present the wax organ at a shrine in an effort to call upon the divine to ease their patient's suffering. Alternatively, they would make a limb-shaped candle and burn it at a shrine for patients with arm or leg issues, such as gangrene. While not uncommon at the time, if you see your barber burning a wax effigy of your knees, it's probably time to find a new barber, or just get new knees. Barbers also doubled as dentists in the Middle Ages. because apparently anyone who used pointy instruments at work were considered general practitioners. Like their general medical skills, some of their dental techniques were simultaneously modern and terrifyingly primitive. To start, the barber would scrape your teeth using toothpicks and scraps of cloth. Okay, so far so good. But to whiten the teeth, the barber would use something called aqua fortis, or strong water. That is good branding. It sounds strong. However, aqua fortis was actually highly corrosive nitric acid, which will clean your teeth according to a generous definition of the word clean. In point of fact, it did do the job it was employed for. One historian says teeth were known to be considerably whiter after, but only because it ate away at the enamel, essentially destroying the tooth from the outside in. Between the acid mouthwash and the pea shampoo, we're beginning to think medieval barbers shouldn't be trusted with anything. For a long stretch in the Middle Ages, barbers, for whatever reason, didn't receive the same level of respect as university-educated physician monks. Can't imagine why. Physicians and surgeons of the time generally didn't debase themselves by performing things like bloodletting, kidney stone removal, and tooth extraction. Furthermore, the Pope had outright forbidden physicians from performing certain procedures like bloodletting. This meant barbers were often tasked with the unpleasant grunt work procedures. Additionally, barbers were brought in to do the gory elbow work of dissection, while a physician or anatomist walked them through it, step by step. Physician Andreas Vesalius, who lived from 1514 to 1564, helped shake up that status quo like a can of shaving beer when he argued, during his second ever anatomical lecture, that the anatomist would be better served by doing the work themselves. Vesalius simply took the knife away from the barber and never looked back. Vesalius was a take-charge kind of guy who did what he felt needed to be done. He even stole the cadavers of executed criminals to use them for practice. That sounds like unpleasant work. I think I know a few barbers who could help you out with that. Sure, you may think it would stink being a medieval peasant, but do you know just how stinky? Although cleanliness in the Middle Ages was primitive compared to what modern people enjoy, it doesn't mean medieval hygiene didn't exist. They may not have had indoor plumbing, shampoo, or nail salons, but they made do with what they had, which in most cases wasn't a whole lot. If you think owning more than one set of clothes is a luxury, let's just say you'd fit right in. Today we're exploring, what's that smell? Oh, it's just the hygiene habits of medieval peasants. Overall, hygiene in medieval Europe was an upward battle. The abundance of waste and inefficient methods of dealing with it resulted in disease. Such waste added to an abundance of vermin, fleas, and lice, which in turn caused sickness and even plague. Hygiene in medieval times relied on washing often and utilizing herbs and flowers to deter pests and provide pleasant odors. If you like taking lukewarm baths and dirty, small amounts of water, hop in a time machine back to the medieval era. While many upper-class people could bathe in tubs with hot water and many of the middle-class folk made use of public baths, peasants had to make do with much, much less. Since there was no running water and peasants had to haul water from wells or rivers to their homes by hand, bathing required a lot of labor. Many people had to bathe with a small amount of water, and it was often unheated. So those who didn't have a suitable area in their homes bathed outdoors. Since many peasants performed manual labor all day, bathing helped remove dirt and stinky sweat, and it also helped them avoid lice and fleas. They didn't always use soap, but when they did, it often consisted of an alkaline solution, such as a mixture of salt and lime. Since bathing required so much work, some peasants decided not to wash at all. The lucky few who got to live in castles used toilets consisting of a bench with a hole placed over an opening leading to a cesspit. Peasants did not have this luxury. That's right, a bench with a poo hole was considered the lap of luxury. Instead, the lower classes made use of outhouses and often had to share them with the community. Those who did not have outhouse access used chamber pots. And if chamber pots were out of their budget, they used waste buckets. People then emptied their chamber pots and waste buckets into nearby cesspits or into the river. Instead of toilet paper, medieval peasants used straw, grass, moss, or hay to wipe themselves. And let's take a brief, uncomfortable moment to talk about these cesspits that people would readily throw their bodily waste into. In addition to number 1 and number 2, people also dumped their garbage into the pits, adding to the stench. Can you imagine if your job was to clean out the garbage and dung-filled cesspits? Well, it was someone's job, and that unlucky someone had to do their best to empty as much of it as they could, and even still, the cesspits often leaked and contaminated the groundwater and soil. Hate shopping? Become a medieval peasant and you won't have to worry about owning more than one set of clothes. Layering was common for the peasant class. Clothing worn next to the skin was made of linen, and heavier wool garments were worn on top of the undergarments. People understood that washing their clothing helped keep parasites away, and etiquette books advised changing one's underwear every day. For peasants, however, that often wasn't an option. If you were one of the lucky ones who could afford more than one set of clothing, you change into fresh garments once a week while washing your other clothing. Peasants who couldn't afford to send their garments to a professional laundress did their laundry themselves, washing their clothes in the river, typically with lye soap. Unfortunately, medieval rivers were often polluted with human waste, garbage, and runoff from animals' waste in the streets. For medieval people, especially peasants, dealing with fleas and lice was a fact of life. Parasites were such a problem that comb makers began adding finer teeth so users could remove dirt and lice while combing their hair. That's right. You can thank the lice-covered medieval peasants for your favorite fine-tooth comb technology. People often use their fingers to do the same job and will get together to delouse one another. As strange as it sounds, delousing groups formed a social activity for peasants. We are like bonobos. Although it was difficult, peasants in medieval times liked to keep themselves as clean as they could. Not only was keeping oneself clean a sign of pride in this culture, many considered it common etiquette. Popular etiquette especially advised people to wash their face and hands after waking up and to continue the practice of hand washing throughout the day. Even peasants could do so, as it didn't require much water, which they would have had to collect through hard labor by carrying it to their homes. Since peasants didn't have utensils and instead ate with their hands, washing hands before and after a meal was especially important. Memory foam mattresses are great, but beds made of straw are just as good, right? Beds made of straw were relatively comfortable and provided insulation for medieval peasants. Although peasants sometimes changed the straw inside their mattresses, many didn't change it frequently enough, and bugs and vermin attracted to the straw stuck around for long periods of time. Peasants with these kind of mattresses frequently suffered from bed bugs. Fleas, lice, and rats would also infest the straw. In order to combat this, people mixed scented flowers and herbs, such as mint, chamomile, and lavender, in with the straw. If they could afford it, peasants also had linen sheets and woolen blankets to cover themselves as they slept. Just a few years before diva cups would get invented, it was obviously no easy task to be menstruating in the time of medieval peasantry. Although not much is known about the topic, historians believed women resorted to using a variety of items during their periods. Many women probably used rags they tore up. Other theories suggest some women wrapped strips of cloth around a small twig and used it as a tampon, or possibly collected absorbent moss and used it as a pad. It's also very likely some women did nothing and simply bled on their clothing. Religious authorities placed shame on menstruation, and many women felt they had to disguise it. They may have carried scented herbs or flowers with them to mask any odor. But considering medieval women didn't live long, and many peasant women lived hard lives involving heavy labor and little sustenance, it's entirely possible that women had fewer periods during their short lives than women do in modern times. In the absence of toothbrushes, peasants used twigs to clean their teeth. Yum! They especially enjoyed using small branches from hazel trees. Some people also rubbed a piece of wool over their teeth and rinsed their mouth with water. Those who could afford it mixed things like salt and sage together to form a paste to freshen breath and whiten teeth. Because their diet included virtually no sugar due to their limited finances, peasants actually didn't suffer from that many cavities. The stone-ground bread they ate, however, caused their teeth to wear down. If a peasant's dental hygiene wasn't enough and they developed a problem with a tooth, they would have to have it removed. Instead of a dentist, barbers performed most dental work. Since there was no anesthesia available, patients resorted to getting drunk before having their teeth worked on. Who needs forks and knives when you can grab your dirty food with your dirty hands and chomp down on it with your dirty mouth? The diet of medieval peasants consisted mostly of what they could grow on their farms: beans, grains, vegetables, and onions. Depending on how closely a peasant lived to a cesspit or contaminated water source, the soil used to grow food and the water used to prepare meals could be tainted with human or animal waste. With no refrigeration, fresh vegetables were an impossibility in winter, and the grains and root vegetables they stored could rot or become infested with vermin. Fungi could poison grains if people weren't careful, and people could suffer bouts of stomach distress, diarrhea, or other sickness due to spoiled food. Meat was a luxury many peasants couldn't afford, but if they managed to earn enough to buy some or slaughter one of their own animals, they had to dry the meat with salt. Otherwise, it would decay. And if the crops failed and the weather was poor, those unlucky peasants would likely starve. Medicine wasn't exactly a strong suit for medieval peasants, or medieval doctors of any creed for that matter. Doctors in medieval times adopted the theory of humorism and made connections between organs of the body, seasons, elements, and tempers. This led to believe sickness happened when the body was out of balance. They also thought parasites originated within people's bodies and caused the imbalance to occur. Doctors theorized that controlling one's diet, such as eating less fruit, could help prevent the body from producing lice. What they didn't realize, however, was that poor waste management and some people's failure to bathe often led parasites to be attracted to some people. No matter how many times people washed their hands, the lack of understanding about the connection between filth, infestation, and sickness meant no one was safe from parasites and disease. Mirrors were a luxury item, and at the time were either made of lead-backed glass or polished metal, but it was difficult to see a clear image. Vanity was clearly a rich man's game during the medieval era. Mirrors were often small, so many men in medieval times went to a barber for their weekly shave. Many peasants couldn't afford to pay someone for a shave, and some didn't own mirrors, so many decided not to shave at all, making most medieval villages a total beard town. Bacteria was everywhere for medieval peasants. In fact, living with parasites was such a common occurrence in medieval times that people tried different herbal remedies to get rid of them. Some used common items peasants might find around their home, such as spreading glue on a slice of bread and sticking a candle in the middle to attract the fleas that infested people's beds. Other remedies were not effective, like getting rid of lice nets by washing hair with salt water from the sea or sniffing lavender. If the weird glue toast wouldn't work, people sometimes tried to smoke and steam to get rid of so-called toothworms and mites. They would burn chamomile seeds and inhale the smoke or hold infected limbs over steaming water. To get rid of earworms, non-existent parasites that were widely believed to exist, doctors poured bitter medicine into people's ears. They also used bitter herbs to wipe out parasites elsewhere. However, the herbs caused horrible diarrhea. So basically, a total disaster. If a patient vomited or suffered a painful BM, doctors would literally think they were cursed. In the medieval world, encounters with monarchs were not reserved for the nobility alone. Though it might seem surprising, even commoners were, on occasion, able to meet their lords. Today, we're going to take a look at what it was really like when medieval commoners met their kings and queens. Okay, I'm a little nervous here. Do these shoes work? How does my hair look? Oh, the video's starting. You're probably thinking we wrote that card backwards. Surely it was the beggar who had to wash the royals' feet, right? Well, no. As figures who derived their authority from religion, kings and queens often performed rituals with religious roots. And one such ritual was the washing of beggars' feet. The ritual was exactly what it sounds like. A king or queen would literally wash the feet of a beggar. This ritual was adapted from the biblical story of Jesus bathing his followers' feet. European royals, ranging from England's Edward II to Maria de Luna of Aragon, typically performed the ritual around Easter. In these instances, commoners were props in royal performances of piety and religious devotion. There's no record of whether or not there were bragging rights associated with having the king wash your feet, but we'd like to imagine there was. Medieval kings often claimed divine authority and liked to show off their God-given powers by healing the sick. One royal ritual, touching for the king's evil, was performed from around the 11th to the 17th centuries. It involved people with scrofula, a lymphatic disease, lining up before their monarch to be healed of their illness. Scrofula was known as the king's evil at the time because it was considered an evil a king could cure. The king or queen would place their hands on the person and present them with a specially made coin. Theoretically, the person would then be cured, or get to play Super Pac-Man. King Edward the Confessor of England is often credited with kickstarting the ritual in the 11th century. Edward attended to a woman suffering from scrofula by dipping his hands in a vessel of water and using his fingers to sprinkle the woman's face as well as the areas infected with the contagion. He would do this over and over while making the sign of the cross. The process would make the diseased parts soften and loosen the scabs. Then worms would come out from several openings, along with, and we're quoting here, much bloodier matter. The king would then draw out the matter with his hand until he had removed all the noxious plague. He would then pay for her care until she was restored to full health. For what it's worth, the witness claimed the process worked, saying, "God has wiped away all her unsightliness and fashioned her with sweet comeliness." I'd like that for my BBL. The idea that Edward could heal the woman suggested he was in direct communication with God, a belief most monarchs were happy to spread in the Middle Ages. However, though the practice continued for several centuries, not all monarchs participated. William of Orange, for instance, was skeptical of his ability to heal anything. Meetings between common subjects and sovereigns could be political in nature. Indeed, one such meeting occurred in 1381 against the backdrop of the so-called Peasants' Revolt, a political and economic uprising in England. King Richard II met with the movement's leader, Wat Tyler, on June 15, 1381. The meeting did not go well. The Lord Mayor of London attacked Tyler, who then attacked his attacker. Tyler was apprehended and executed that day. If you're not surprised that a commoner was the only one who wound up dead after this meeting, well, neither are we. Relationships between royals and commoners sounds like the stuff of romance novels. But they did happen sometimes. Kings and queens not only took untitled lovers, but sometimes they even married commoners. Take King Edward IV of England, for example, who had multiple romantic relationships with commoners. His mistress Jane Shore was quite well off, especially by late medieval standards, but she wasn't titled, which technically made her just a very rich commoner. Edward's wife Elizabeth Woodville was officially a commoner as well. A medieval monarch's most public event was the royal entry into cities and towns, and civic officials and tradesmen would often serve key roles in these processions. According to medieval chronicler Jean Froissart, when Isabella of Bavaria, who was King Charles VI's royal bride, entered Paris in 1389, no less than 1,200 citizens of Paris participated in the spectacle. High-ranking wealthy commoners may have gotten an audience with, or at least an introduction to, the monarch during such royal visits. These royal entries were massive spectacles. Cities and towns would be decked out in regalia, and might even host street performances. Commoners could even enjoy free alcohol, so you can imagine these events were popular. In fact, during Isabella's procession, Froissart recalled that a fountain near Saint-Denis was repurposed to mark the occasion. Instead of water, it ran in great streams of claret, an excellent piment for all who chose to drink. The French know how to party. King Louis IX of France, who reigned from 1226 to 1270, took his duties very seriously. He didn't just give daily audiences to commoners, he also came to them and met them in an egalitarian setting. In fact, Louis regularly held a court for commoners under an oak tree at Vincennes. This move allowed him to directly interact with his subjects, no matter where they fell in the social hierarchy of medieval France. It's like a medieval equivalent of a modern U.S. president doing one of those town hall meetings. It was a pretty cool move for a French king. Royal ceremonies and rituals sometimes depended on the participation of commoners, albeit often just as props for the royals to show off to. For example, on some important occasions, like marriages, coronations, or religious ceremonies, kings and queens would demonstrate their piety by giving out alms to the poor. Though many monarchs would have agents do this for them, some of them participated personally. King Ladislaus I of Hungary, for example, doled out alms himself in front of a basilica in the 11th century. Part of being a medieval ruler meant giving audiences to their subjects, mostly so the subjects could complain about stuff. One ruler who had to take part in such audiences was King Charles V of France, who ruled from 1364 to 1380. Medieval chronicler Christine de Peasants recorded Charles's regimented days, including his daily meetings with commoners to hear their petitions and grievances. According to Christine de Peasants, Charles would meet with commoners after attending religious services. As he came out of the chapel, all sorts of people, rich or poor, ladies or maidens, widows or others who had problems, could make their petitions to him, and he very kindly would pause to listen to their supplications. Charles is said to have usually responded charitably to those that were reasonable or piteous, while the more doubtful of cases would be turned over to some master of requests to examine. In the Middle Ages, European monarchies became more closely tied to religion. Kings and queens were often seen as something akin to gods by their subjects, and they usually demanded to be treated accordingly. As a result, there were things that subjects could not do in front of their monarch. Take the aforementioned Wat Tyler. Remember him? The commoner who led the Peasants' Revolt in England? He failed to exhibit proper etiquette when he met King Richard II. According to chronicler Jean Froissart, Tyler sent for a flagon of water to rinse his mouth, and when it was brought, rinsed his mouth in a very rude and disgusting fashion before the king's face. The peasant leader also drew his dagger in the king's presence. Tyler's seemingly coarse behavior in front of his divinely appointed king was enough to provoke the Lord Mayor to strike him. And, well, you know how things turn out after that. Kings and queens typically maintained links with religious communities through patronage. This meant that abbeys and monasteries received wealth, gifts, and certain privileges from the royal household. But surprise, surprise, the wealth and prestige that came with royal patronage didn't come for free. The kings and queens expected abbeys and monasteries to accommodate them when traveling their kingdom, an expectation that could put financial and logistical burdens on the religious communities. Medieval kings and queens technically facilitated the law of the land, but they increasingly relied on traveling agents to dole out justice. In other words, representatives of the crown would travel the kingdom and oversee trials on the monarch's behalf. However, royals did personally oversee some trials, usually high-profile ones involving aristocrats and officials, but that wasn't always the case. France's Louis IX, for example, served as a judge for trials accessible to anyone. As Jean de Joinville recounted in the 13th century, those who had any suit to present could come to speak to Louis IX, without hindrance from an usher or any other person. According to Joinville, the king would ask if anyone had a case to be settled, and anyone who did would stand up. The king would then assure all those standing that they would be heard in turn. He would then turn the proceedings over to his officials to settle. However, if he saw anything needing correction in what was said by those who spoke on his behalf, or on behalf of any other person, he would himself intervene to make the necessary adjustment. Medieval kingship wasn't all royal weddings and foot washings. It was also partly defined by military prowess. Indeed, kings who personally led troops into battle were often revered across Europe. Among the most celebrated warrior kings were Robert the Bruce of Scotland and Henry V of England. That being said, personally leading troops into battle was extremely risky, so even while fighting, kings would have been surrounded by an elite group of knights and attendants for extra protection. Despite this, kings would still fall from time to time. England's Richard I, famously nicknamed the Lionheart for his regal bravery, was brought down by a crossbow while managing a siege in France. Richard III was also slain on the field of battle. Contrary to Tom Petty, it's not always good to be the king. It may come as no surprise that medieval Europeans had grand Christmas celebrations. Medieval Christmas feasts, however, were more than just another meal. They were opportunities to cook the most elaborate medieval foods with the most lavish and exotic ingredients. So, today we're going to take a look at what people in the medieval era ate during Christmas feasts. In the modern era, the name boar's head is widely associated with deli meats. But in the medieval era, they were very literal, and if someone mentioned boar's head, they were talking about the head of a boar. Boar's head was one of the most common foods associated with Yuletide festivities. The folk tradition was passed down from ancient Germanic origins and continued into Christian celebration through Anglo-Saxon culture. The delicacy was so closely associated with Christmas festivities that a well-known song was put into written history around 1500 called the Boar's Head Carol. The first stanza reads, "I bring back the boar's head, singing praises to the Lord. The boar's head in hands I bring, with garland gay and birds singing. I pray you all help me to sing who are at this banquet." Okay, it's not quite Frosty the Snowman, but it's not terrible either. In medieval times, a Christmas feast just wasn't a Christmas feast without a boar's head. That being said, not everyone could afford a wild boar. As an alternative, medieval people sometimes baked a cake in the shape of a boar's head to make the table festive. For those with the wealth to serve the real thing, a 16th century German cookbook recommended boiling a wild boar's head and then basting it with wine and serving it with a black sauce, made from fat, wheat flour, wine, and cherry syrup. To add more flavor to the sauce, cooks could add sugar, ginger, pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. And to add more texture, they could mix in chopped grapes, raisins, and almonds. Christmas was one of the most important feasting days on the medieval calendar. Those with the means often showed off elaborate dishes like a roast peacock that was usually served redressed in its own feathers. Ooh, you're so fancy and tasty, Mr. Peacock. Yes, medieval cooks would skin and roast the whole peacock and then cover it in its own feathers in order to recreate the look of a live bird. The peacock dish was a big deal, and the lady with the highest title had the honor of carrying it out to the table. Roast peacock was often served with sauce. One 15th century Italian cookbook, for example, offered the following recipe for peacock sauce. Mix ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper. Add to them wine and sprinkle in a little sugar. Add some of the peacock's drippings to the sauce and serve. Roasted peacock, however, did have its problems. Depending on the age and diet of the peacock, the flavor and texture could be off-putting. As a substitute for poor quality peacocks, cooks often took the skin of the bird but replaced the bird's meat with goose, sewing better quality meat within a more exotic fowl. Sounds like a medieval turducken. In the medieval era, Christmas celebrations often stretched on for days. As a result, Christmas traditions blended with surrounding saint days, such as St. Lucia's Day. St. Lucia, aka Lucia of Syracuse, was a Christian martyr who lived from 283 to 304 and was famous for allegedly having her eyes gouged out before being killed by a sword to the throat. That's a rough way to get fame. What was her crime, you ask? Well, she wanted to give some portion of her family's riches to the poor. Yeah, bah humbug to you. A traditional feast in her honor was observed by Western Christians on December 13th, when people often celebrated with St. Lucia buns. A modern recipe for St. Lucia buns calls for saffron in the dough. After forming the dough and kneading it, press raisins into the dough to represent the martyr St. Lucia's gouged eyes. Nothing says eat me like gouged eye bread. Moist. King Richard of England, famously known as Richard the Lionheart, served his Christmas guests mincemeat pies. At the time, they were known as Christmas pies, which, to be honest, sounds much more like a marketable product name than mincemeat pie. The association between mincemeat pies and Christmas dates back to the Crusades, when Crusaders returned with exotic Eastern spices like ginger, cloves, and nutmeg, supposedly used to represent the gifts of the Magi. Cooks used the spices to season meats left over from the winter slaughter, and then added fruits and other spices before baking the mixture in a pastry shaped like a manger. The pie was topped with a pastry baby Jesus to represent his birth. Mincemeat lovers tried to eat a mincemeat pie for each of the 12 days of Christmas, but they were not allowed to cut the pies with a knife, as it was thought to be unlucky, since they would be cutting through the crib of baby Jesus. The tradition of mincemeat pies for Christmas continues to this day, but the pies have since stopped resembling the biblical manger, which is probably for the best, because now you can use a knife. Eel, along with other fish, was a popular Christmas dish, but Europeans prepared eel differently depending on the region. In Sweden, eel was served in a mustard sauce or smoked. Southern Europeans sometimes cooked eel in wine or almond milk. Medieval Germans simmered eel in wine and added saffron and ginger. One Venetian recipe called for the cook to slowly cook borlotti beans for 1.5 hours. The recipe then says to add butter, an onion, celery, and a carrot before finally placing garlic and eel into the stew, bringing it to a boil. So yeah, there were lots of options for cooking it, but the bottom line is, Europeans love that eel meal. Gingerbread's association with Christmas has been around since the Middle Ages. One 15th century English recipe starts with a quart of honey, boiled and skimmed. The chef would then mix in saffron and pepper. Next, they would add grated bread and some cinnamon and shape the mixture into a square. Another common technique bakers used for gingerbread was to use molds or stamps. These wooden molds were designed to allow bakers to shape their food, similar to how people created gingerbread men today. Many households in the medieval era featured pottage on their Christmas table. It was an encompassing word for any food cooked in a pot. Appropriately enough, it was often a stew. Thus, pottage could feature a plethora of different meats, vegetables, or fruits. For example, one recipe for Christmas pottage started by boiling a leg of beef and then adding red wine, beer, and spices like clove and nutmeg to give the pottage its Christmassy flavor. Next, the cook would add boiled apples, currants, raisins, and prunes. After some time, the beef could be removed and eaten separately from the rest of the pottage. Another type of pottage, called porree, was a particular favorite. Made from boiled leeks, porree probably most closely resembled what we would call today leek soup. Figgy pudding, prominently mentioned in the traditional carol We Wish You a Merry Christmas, was a kind of thickened medieval porridge. Unlike modern figgy puddings, medieval figgy pudding resembled a stew rather than a solid dish. A recipe in a 14th century English cookbook instructed cooks to start by blanching almonds and grinding them up. After adding wine and water, the cook needed to add quartered figs, raisins, ginger, and honey before boiling it down until it became thick. Instead of eggnog, medieval Europeans drank posset at Christmas. This thick alcoholic beverage included egg, cream, and beer or wine, which was then thickened with bread, oatmeal, or almond paste. One 17th century recipe recommended boiling a quart of cream with whole spice. While boiling the cream, beat 16 eggs and mix them with hot white wine. Stir the eggs and wine into the cream and let it sit for at least 30 minutes over low heat. The cream will curdle into a consistency like cheese. A thinner neighbor of posset, known as syllabub, might also find its place at the Christmas table. Sugar plums were a seasonal favorite for 16th century cooks and a common accoutrement on any medieval spice plate. According to John Gerard, a 16th century herbalist and author, fresh plums contained little nutritional value. However, drying plums transformed them into a more wholesome dish. Plus, preserving the plums made them last longer. A 16th century method for making sugar plums starts with boiling plums in clarified sugar and leaving them dipped in sugar for 3 days. After removing the fruit, boil the syrup with more sugar. Add back in the fruit and let it simmer. Place the plums on a drying rack and then turn them every other day. Once dry, the sugar plums could last all year. And during the Christmas season, visions of them can dance in children's heads while they've nestled all snug in their beds. Many Christmas recipes call for beer because, hey, it's Christmas. But in addition to cooking with beer, a Christmas feast might feature tankards of ale. 'Tis the season to be merry. Medieval ale production was ubiquitous. It wasn't mass-produced since ale couldn't be preserved for long, so most households made their own. Unlike today's beer, medieval ale didn't contain hops. It was often watery and made from grain, water, and yeast, but it was beloved by Europeans of all classes. A medieval recipe for ale calls for over 4 pounds of malt, 1.5 pounds of rolled oats, and 13 quarts of water. After boiling the water, crush the malt and mix it with the oats. Mix the boiling water and the malty oats, adding the water slowly to let the mixture stand. This process takes several hours. After removing the wort, mix in 2 packages of ale yeast. It takes several days to ferment the ale. Christmas was the day to feature fancy meats. Even poorer families might slaughter a goose for Christmas dinner, or if lucky, Scrooge might send them one after being visited by 3 ghosts. Okay, that wasn't the medieval era, but come on, it's a good reference. Moving along, one recipe for stuffed goose dates at least to the 14th century. The recipe required the cook to stuff the goose with sage, parsley, quinces, pears, garlic, and grapes, and roast it. After it had finished roasting, the cooks dressed and served the stuffed goose with a sauce made from grease, wine, and sweet spices. Spiced wines went by many names: Hippocras, Piment, and mulled wine. However, one of the most common types of wine in medieval Europe was claret, though it wasn't the high-quality Bordeaux wine we associate the word with today. Spiced wines usually ended most medieval feasts, including Christmas. Most were often very simple to make, consisting of wine, some kind of sweetener, which was generally honey, and, true to its name, spices. Medieval times dinner and tournament is a rite of passage for most red-blooded Americans. Sure, eating chicken without forks has its charm, but it's hardly historically accurate to the real medieval times. A real medieval diet could be surprisingly heart-healthy, featuring items that are trendy and recognizable in our modern era. Today, we're going to explore what the average medieval diet was like. Though it might feel like more of a recent trend, people in the medieval times would get down with some alternative dairy products. Much like a home in the hippie-filled Topanga Canyon, almond milk was a common pantry household in medieval Europe. It was often used in times of fasting, when the church required people to abstain from consuming animal products. It also didn't spoil as quickly as cow or goat's milk and could be whipped up into butter and used in an array of dishes. Almond milk was such a staple of the time, most medieval cookbooks contain recipes featuring almond milk as main ingredient. While medieval knights weren't taking chariots through late-night drive-thru to drunkenly eat a medium Big Mac combo with a Coke, there was a variation of fast food in the Middle Ages. Archaeologists probably won't find an ancient, decrepit pair of golden arches, but they did have places that served meat pies, hotcakes, pancakes, and wafers prepared for immediate consumption. Wait, that actually sounds more like the Waffle House. According to researchers at Penn State, these medieval McDonald's had a similar reputation as Mickey D's as being lower in quality, if not still very tasty, and were thought of as dirty and dishonest. Researchers also discovered these fast casual joints of yore used the term meat loosely, sometimes using tainted rabbit in meat pies that probably were not labeled rancid rabbit meat pies. Just like Greg in the office, medieval peasants loved bread. A typical diet of a medieval European included 2 to 3 pounds of bread and grain per day, including the gallon of grainy, low-alcohol percentage ale for which to wash it down. Peasants got creative with their grains, such as wheat, oats, and barley, boiling them down into a mushy bowl of porridge or baking a loaf of bread. Rarely did they pair their carbs with red meat, opting instead to use peas, lentils, or fish to satisfy their protein needs. The calories on this naturally added up, with 2.5 pounds of rye bread amounting to 3,000 calories or 5.5 Big Macs, which is far too much for most people at one time. Factor in the gallon of ale, contributing an additional 1,500 calories, and it's a wonder the medieval times wasn't full of obese peasants. But with 12-hour workdays of actual labor, they probably had calories to spare. As would be the case at today's medieval times restaurants, raw fruits and vegetables had no business on most medieval times dinner tables. Researchers from the British Library Board discovered that fruits and vegetables were almost always cooked in the Middle Ages due to the belief that raw fruits and veggies were riddled with disease. A feature of vegetables still happening today, as evidenced by the myriad of romaine lettuce and spinach recalls. In the Book of Carving from the year 1500, readers were cautioned against consuming salads and raw fruits. Beware of green salads and raw fruits, for they will make your master sick. Aromatic fresh herbs were not lumped with their sickly, leafy green brothers, and were often used for medicine and cooking. A salad at the dinner table was not completely unheard of for the lower-class citizens of the Middle Ages, however, with salat filling the bellies of the plebeians designated just good enough for food that came from the dirty ground. Carrots, turnips, and other root vegetables were considered a more peasant-y food. A commoner salad may consist of a variety of vegetables such as lettuce, onions, and carrots, and even mixed in with oil, nuts, or olives, or what sounds like a typical side salad at most Italian restaurants. The rich typically shunned the vegetable, a word that was rarely used to describe produce, but would deem the occasional onion, garlic, or leek to be worthy of their dinner table spread and, unfortunately for the booze, their mouths. The stereotypical image of a medieval feast features a full roasted pig as its centerpiece, and the image was, in fact, quite a common occurrence at the dinner table for anyone who was well-to-do. Pork was considered one of the highest on the hog of meats and fat in medieval Europe, and the suckling pig in particular was a coveted main course. A suckling pig is what it sounds like, a very young pig who was most likely suckling on its mother's teat before being made into dinner. Like veal today, whose preparation is not far off from its young swine friend, the meat was considered a delicacy. Historians agree that suckling pig was a real status symbol as far as meat affluence goes. Sow's womb was also a delicacy that appeared in medieval cookbooks. Succulent suckling. Often referred to as the most important meal of the day now, back in these days, breakfast was for the fatties and the people who were working their tails off, or at least according to medieval priest Thomas Aquinas. Thomas thought eating too soon at the beginning of the day, or preproperi for all the fans of Latin, was just one of the many ways to commit one of the 7 deadly sins of gluttony. The Middle Ages meal plan, which will be all the rage with influencers in no time, consisted of skipping breakfast, a light midday dinner, and a hearty evening supper. Occasionally, some hungry little rascals would sneak in a third meal called re-supper or rear supper with wine and ale, but that was frowned upon. Laborers would eat something akin to breakfast in the morning before heading off to a strenuous 12-hour workday, but wasn't no Denny's Moons over my hammy. It was more of a piece of biscuit or something to just fill the belly before that light midday supper break as to not pass out in the fields. Meat was a hot commodity in this era, which made it hard to come by for the plebeians of the time. but even the wealthy weren't extremely picky. Records from the time list a luxurious smorgasbord of meat on the menu, including vultures, cranes, hedgehogs, who we are assuming are mostly needles, seals, and whales, just to name a few. At one specific yummy light dinner thrown by Archbishop Neville of York in 1467, a guest list of 6,000 people managed to eat their way through several tons of meat, including swans, peacocks, and over 13,500 non-specific birds, and wash that all down with 400 casks worth of alcohol. With no easy access to a honey-baked ham for a Christmas dinner, our medieval friends had to make do. Though occasionally the king would allow for a Christmas swan, it was mainly the traditional Christmas goose for both the extremely wealthy and the less extremely wealthy for the holiday meal. Rich folks smothered their fancy geese with a snobby rich people rub consisting of butter and saffron, while it's assumed poorer families had a bland goose that cost them a whole day's pay. But the rich and the poor enjoyed an humble pie, which, yes, is where the expression humble pie originated from. But man, did it sound very interesting. Humble pie was pie made of deer or another animal's edible entrails, cooked into a pie. Beans were the real culinary game changer once they entered the scene for medieval Europeans. Umberto Eco argued that when the cultivation of legumes began to spread in the 10th century, it made such an impact on the nutrition of the population, it was a major factor in the survival of Western civilization. That might sound hyperbolic, but the addition of beans to the diets of hard workers meant more protein for a society where meat was hard to come by for the less economically advantaged. The population doubled within a few hundred years after beans hit the plates of Europeans. Coincidence? Well, maybe. But keep in mind, beans were thought of as an aphrodisiac. Yes, you know the famous saying, beans, beans, the magical fruit. The more you eat, the more you want to make babies. Baking wars these days might refer more to cute baking competitions between amateur home chefs on Netflix, but back in the Middle Ages, it was taken a little more literally. Baking was a very serious business in these times, with commercial bakers forming powerful guilds that functioned as a cross between a union and the mob. Bakers who joined would pay a fee, making them exclusive members of a club of bakers for a certain region. Those fees acted essentially as an insurance and could pay off down the road if anything ever, happened to your business or your family. Beautiful bakery. Be a shame if something happened to it. Nah, wait. It's insured by the guild, and it would be fine. The guilds also protected the family recipes of master bakers, assuming that nobody else would open bakeries using a stolen recipe from a guild-protected baker. These guilds sure didn't flam around. Sweets were not likely a treat for the commoners of the Middle Ages, but not completely unheard of in the middle class. A middle-class feast was often traditionally served as one would a family-style dinner today, with several courses landing at the table at once, as opposed to several courses paced throughout the evening. With this gluttonous feast of cartoon-like proportions, desserts were interspersed between the courses as a kind of palate cleanser, which is how dessert should be served, all the time after every single bite of food. One such dessert was known as a soltiti, which was described as an elaborate ornamental offering made from dough or marzipan, often depicting a thematically appropriate theme for the occasion, such as night battle or baking guild enrollment ceremony. King Richard III, being a king and all, sure did eat like one, right up until his death in the last Battle of the Roses in 1485. How do we know this? He ate so richly it funneled down into his bones. Archaeologists, geochemists, and other researchers analyzed King Richard's bones and were able to conclude that he did, in fact, eat a rich, high-status diet of a wealthy aristocrat, which makes sense. Specifically, the researchers were able to miraculously narrow down his diet to include plenty of freshwater fish and wildfowl, and in his last few years, a bunch of wine, just by examining his bones. Richard III may have been the last plantogenic king of England, but he had the dietary bones of a suburban housewife in ketosis. The Mediterranean diet gets all the hype for being a heart-healthy alternative to standard American diets of cheeseburgers and donuts, but really the medieval diet is the one that should be glorified on all the pages of Goop. The folks back in the Middle Ages didn't have the modern medicine we have now, and the Black Death thing wasn't great, but in general, people then had a better diet for the human heart than most people have today. Eating 3 pounds of bread may not sound heart-healthy, but it was more nuanced than that. This civilization lacked the refined sugars found in many foods today, and workers actually worked, participating in heart-healthy exercise just to get a paycheck, with the benefit of living longer as a fun little bonus. Dr. Roger Henderson told the BBC his research concluded that the medieval man was at much lower risk for coronary heart disease and diabetes than the modern man, and suggested it as a better model for us in the 21st century than the much ballyhooed Mediterranean diets. Don't feel guilty about eating pounds of bread smothered in almond butter while shunning the salad bar. Just tell the people it's the medieval diet and laugh as you live forever. Just be sure to work a 12-hour workday 6 days a week. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church held a level of power and influence over the population that is almost inconceivable today. This power came from a combination of factors, including persuasion, corruption, and coercion, but most of all, straight-up fear-mongering. Yes, the medieval church was heavily invested in the business of scaring the faithful into staying faithful. Today, we're going to take a look at how the medieval Catholic Church frightened its parishioners into obedience. These days, when people hear the term Hellmouth, they're most likely to think of the television series Buffy the Vampire Slayer, if they think of anything at all. Indeed, modern visitors to medieval churches and cathedrals would probably regard the frightening sculpted images appearing over the entryway as mere art or ornamentation. But for the populace of the medieval era, who were superstitious and uneducated, the image of the Hellmouth was nothing short of terrifying. The Hellmouth was typically depicted as a ferocious beast devouring sinners during the Last Judgment. It was the first thing that parishioners would see on their way into the sanctuary, and the message was crystal clear: obey the church, or this will happen to you. Wow, they were very, very subtle. Purgatory, in the Catholic religion, is an intermediate state that comes after death where people can expiate their sins before moving on to heaven. In medieval times, churchgoers were extremely concerned about how much time they might have to spend there. Luckily, there were several ways a person could ensure their wait wouldn't be overly long. For example, they could donate money and goods to the church, attend services regularly, or even purchase a certificate that could get them an early release. But for those who absolutely, positively had to be sure they would skip purgatory entirely, there was only one surefire way: donate one of their children to the church. In ancient times, religions may have demanded human sacrifice to appease their gods. But the medieval church had a more pragmatic use for these children, namely, replenishing their own numbers. The clergy, of course, is supposed to be celibate, so new priests, nuns, and monks had to be recruited from the general population. While these new recruits didn't have to be children, the church preferred them because they were easier to mold. Didn't the families miss their children? Certainly. But in an era where poverty was common and many already had too many mouths to feed, there was no real choice. What's more, the arrangement could actually wind up being beneficial to everyone involved. For the child, being raised by the church would mean eating better, staying cleaner, and receiving an education. For the parents, the arrangement meant saving money and resources that could be spent on the rest of the family. However, while being raised by the church meant having a full belly, a warm place to sleep, and an education, there was also, predictably, a much darker side to the practice. Many children are known to have been victimized by church leaders in a number of inappropriate ways. Accounts of those who found themselves trapped in a miserable, abusive existence within the church have survived to this very day. To most modern observers, seeing a statue weep would be greeted by immediate skepticism. One might suppose the statue had been cracked and taken on water from some outside source, or perhaps deception was involved and some devious person placed a water hose inside the statue to create an illusion. Seeing a statue weep blood might make one suspect something rusty was leaking onto it. Yet even today we hear reports of people witnessing statues they believe are crying real tears or bleeding real blood. Often they believe these tears are sent by Christ or some other heavenly figure. So you can imagine how easily the overwhelmingly superstitious and religious population of medieval days would have easily accepted such a sight. Indeed, weeping and bleeding statues were commonly considered powerful omens of evil or sad events to come, an interpretation that was quite useful for a church seeking to encourage continued obedience. While you'd probably think there's no way to buy oneself out of having committed terrible sins, you'd be dead wrong. In the medieval era, as much as today, the church was quite fond of money, and the faithful could actually buy forgiveness with cash. If enough money was involved, nothing was unforgivable. Even more convenient was that you could purchase a pardon in advance for something you hadn't even done yet. Plan to rob or kill someone? No problem. Just buy yourself an advance pardon and have a good time. It was a great arrangement for those who could afford it, and it made the church a fortune. Call it your get-out-of-jail card for the afterlife. One of the church's other biggest moneymakers was selling tickets out of purgatory, and you could purchase one not just for yourself, but also for your deceased loved ones. Worried that your parents or grandparents have been denied entrance to heaven and are trapped in purgatory? No problem. Purchase the pardon card. For the right price, the church would literally issue you an actual physical certificate that proved your loved one was on the way to heaven. The pardon card. Don't leave life without it. Some things never change. For example, adulterers in medieval times feared pretty much the same exact things modern ones do, namely, getting caught. These days, a revelation like that would probably lead to couples therapy or possibly a divorce. But in the medieval era, that kind of exposure would mean being made an object of public shaming and ridicule. In fact, the term walk of shame originated in that era and was meant quite literally. Accused adulterers might be required to walk nude through the streets under the ridicule of friends and neighbors. Game of Thrones fans are probably thinking of Queen Cersei's famous Walk of Shame right about now, which was based directly on this real-life practice. Not surprisingly, despite this heavy punishment, adultery remained popular. For some, the shame is part of the game. The aforementioned hellmouth sculptures that hung over the church doors were an effective mood setter, but they were only the beginning. Once inside the church, the parishioner would be greeted by images of the end of the world, the Last Judgment, and so-called doom paintings, which depicted the faithful rejoicing with God in heaven, while the sinners boiled in a lake of fire. That's not all, though. Churches were often filled with altarpieces, statues of tortured saints, and all manner of other images of sinners being punished in hell. The church employed the greatest artists of the day to create these works, and those artists often had vivid and terrifying imaginations. For the medieval church, the need to keep a grip on their power and influence was rivaled only by the drive to make money. Church officials at all levels were primarily concerned with selling get-out-of-purgatory certificates. They also enjoyed spreading the word about how working for the church would ensure your social position on earth and reserve you a spot in heaven. This fixation on profit went so far, parishioners were often warned that any and all expendable income they came into possession of should be given directly to the church. Depending on a person's social status, contributions could come in various forms. If you were poor, you could give livestock or whatever coins you were able to spare. Upper and middle class families, and yes, there was a burgeoning middle class at this point, were also under a great deal of pressure to give. Examples of what such people might donate to stay in the church's good graces include silver candlesticks, linen altar cloths, or even a church pew. The extremely wealthy might even donate something as expensive as an ornate altarpiece or stained glass window, which might depict holy figures along with members of the donor's family. Ever hear someone refer to the seventh level of hell? You probably have, though you may not have realized that phrases like that are an allusion to the first part of Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, namely, the Inferno. This three-part epic poem, written in the 14th century, chillingly details the experience of going through hell, purgatory, and heaven. Considered one of the greatest works of Western literature, the Divine Comedy heavily inspired the artist who created the Hellmouths, as well as all the imagery within the church depicting sinners in hellish circumstances. Ironically, the poem was really just an excuse for its author to blow off steam at his enemies, but it was also something a lot of people could relate to, including the church. In fact, for the church, Dante's Inferno was an invaluable resource for frightening the faithful into strict obedience. Though, of course, much like the rest of their agenda, this had much more to do with keeping people in the habit of giving their money, property, and children over to the church than it did with saving anyone's soul. Medieval cathedrals were often enormous, elaborate buildings, and the fact that many still stand today is a testament to human mastery of architecture, physics, and masonry. These buildings often took several generations to fully construct, and villages and cities would rise up around them. Building a cathedral was difficult and dangerous, but also allowed for an unparalleled level of artistic creativity. For example, the original builders would often carve their own faces into the statuary and motifs on display both inside and outside the buildings. Despite this freedom, the sculptors and masons had to work within the artistic styles favored by the church. This included imagery of Jesus, Mary, and the saints, but also would typically include figures of demons and gargoyles on the building's exterior. These figures would often be depicted near doorways or high up on spires. This way, they could cast their unnerving gazes down upon the sinners entering the church, inspiring them to seek forgiveness and stay obedient. Despite all the fear-mongering the church engaged in to keep their parishioners in line, there are always those who just don't care. Whether because they didn't believe in it or simply felt an eternity of punishment was a fair price for the sins they sought to engage in, the medieval era had plenty of folks who frequently skipped church services. Some preferred to spend their time drinking, gambling, visiting prostitutes, and some just liked sleeping late. Whatever the case, sins like these were punishable offenses. However, as you may have guessed, these sins were absolutely forgivable if the right financial price was paid to the church. And since a failure or refusal to pay the fine constituted a one-way ticket to hell, most people paid up. Of all the positions one could attain during the Middle Ages, the one least desirable was probably that of the serf. The meager serf was at the bottom of an already bleak totem pole of lower class, and didn't share in the same freedoms as their poor brethren, the peasants. Though a landowner could sell the labor of a serf, it could not, and it cannot be stressed enough, sell the serf themselves, making them technically not slaves. At one point, a whopping 75% of the medieval population was a serf. Today we're going to explore how much it sucked to be a serf. In the Vaud, a canton of Switzerland, the law allowed for lords to chastise their serfs like the recommended consumption of Taco Bell while sober, very light. The customary law said punishment could be served to a serf with or without cause, but they drew the line at torment, which was strictly forbidden. Unfortunately, their definition of torment was pretty loose. It was perfectly legal to throw a serf in prison for an indefinite amount of time, or to take all of their possessions, as one might a misbehaving toddler and their toys, but worse, and forever. In Notre Dame, it was legit legal to murder a serf should they get into an argument with the tenants, a law thankfully not extended to modern-day landlords. Take that, Mr. Roper. Since the rules were all over the place and varied substantially from region to region, lords pretty much did what they wanted to do when it came to disciplining serfs. This led to many lords acting in bad faith and skirting the rules with technicalities. For example, in Aragon, a lord could technically kill a man who killed one of his own dependents, but bloodshed was a no-no. So technically, an Aragon lord could and did dispose of serfs through starvation, thirst, or exposure to the elements, as in being tossed out during a very cold night. For a serf, life was hard. Serfs were given a tiny piece of land by the lord within the estate they were living on, which allowed them to harvest and provide food for their own family. Typically, this included just a small plot of land, around 12 acres per family, plus their own personal living quarters. And while they were able to enjoy the fruits of their labor, according to law, everything a serf owned was possession of the lord and could be taken or repurposed with no warning at any time. Serfs were responsible for building their homes and making their clothes, but technically even those tattered rags and flammable huts belonged to the lord. Even the food they harvested for their own personal groceries belonged to the lord, since he owned the land. But it's hard to say how often a lord snatched the food from a serf's harvest like they were a cartoon villain. Kind lords also probably didn't go around taking all of their serfs' possessions for fun. What's a wealthy lord going to do with a serf's little shovel after all? One of the main differences between a serf and a peasant was the ability to leave the land. Serfs were bound to the manor they served, while a peasant was free to roam around and be poor on any street of their choosing. You couldn't tie a peasant down. Think of them as serfs with wanderlust. Peasants were poverty-stricken and relied heavily on the affluent community to provide sustenance, but serfs legally had to pay taxes, rent, and other random payments to their lords. There was no general rule for what financial dues a serf was responsible for, as it varied by region. In most European countries, a serf was treated as part of the estate and came with the land. Serfs weren't seen as slaves during this era because a serf could not be purchased, but their labor could be sold, though this too varied by region. For example, in Russia, a serf was totally up for sale, much more like a slave. Some countries saw serfs as poor little babies whose only purpose in life was to tend to manors and castles until they died. But others saw an opportunity to beef up their military numbers. Russian forces in the Middle Ages were extremely dependent on serf and peasant labor, boosting the amount of soldiers to over 1 million men throughout the 19th century. State-owned peasants, as well as privately owned serfs, were bound to servitude, so this really wasn't a volunteered patriotic calling for serfs in Russia. Russia didn't have a big distinction between a serf and a peasant. A serf who was freed of serfdom would be let loose into society with no land or money, like a theater major, and probably with the same amount of job prospects. Serfs could turn to self-imposed state peasantry since it was better to be supported with some measurable degree of freedom, or like when that theater major moves back in with their parents after college. Beggars can't be choosers. It might be tradition for a man to ask a woman's father for permission to marry his daughter, but in a serf's life, he had to ask his lord before putting a ring on his bride-to-be. It might sound insane to have to double-check with one's boss before popping the question, but remember, a serf was barely considered a human, basically like permanent entry-level peons. The abbot of Upper Swabia, or what today is the modern-day German state of Bavaria, issued a number of decrees designed to oppress the Freisinser, which was a term used to describe free but census-paying tenants, as well as all serfs. The abbot focused his serf-hating energy on placing regulations on who could marry and providing consequences for people who married beneath their class. Oh sure, a serf couldn't marry someone a slight step above a serf, but fives marry tens all the time on TV shows and nobody says anything. Weird history, how Kevin James married all those hotties on TV, coming in the year 2050. If a peasant did get desperate and decide to settle for a penniless serf, half of the peasant's estate would be confiscated, and the other half would be taxed to literal death, with death duties. This kept peasants and serfs humble and poor and knocked many down to an even lower class, with less hope of buying their way out of serfdom. Sounds like a pretty good excuse to never get married. Plus, did the term old maid even exist in these times? What was that? Unmarried at 20 years old? Okay. There was no such thing as calling in sick for a serf with a scratchy throat and a runny nose. That's not to say sick days didn't exist in this time. Some estates provided a set amount of sick days, normally amounting to 2 to 3 weeks throughout the year. How a sick serf was treated varied on laws of the land and what kind of mood the lord was in that day. A cruel lord could very well force his bubonic-plagued serf to work while not providing him 1 minute of sick leave. And if the illness left him incapacitated and unable to work, he could be punished, as if getting the plague wasn't bad enough. And for more information on how much the plague sucked, see some of our other weird history videos. Other manners allowed for serfs to quit all work for the day, with the exception of plowing and other random jobs that needed to be done. Usually the day of work had to be made up at some point within the year, either by himself or through a replacement. As if being a serf wasn't bad enough, serfs also had to find somebody to cover their shift at work? Yeesh. A serf didn't dare say, "That's not in my job description," as their day-to-day lives encompassed a plethora of duties. The men normally stuck with most of the back-breaking agricultural chores, like plowing and mowing the fields, for a real hard day's hard. Apologies, current-day office worker. Because of the intensity of the labor, a serf's work week was a breezy 3 to 4 days. Women serfs may not have been out in the fields all day, but they didn't lack chores of their own to accomplish. Women were in charge of all the cooking, general housework, baking bread, making wool, milking and making butter and cheese, and taking care of whatever children might be in the mix. No time for wine night with the girls. However, should they have decided to have an impromptu wine and cheese night, pressing wine was part of the duties for a serf. Unfortunately, if it required a wine press, well, that came out of the serf's shallow pockets, since it was their responsibility to pay the owner of said wine press. Medieval court systems had no time for nonsense such as serf problems. So whenever a civil dispute would blow up between a serf and a fellow serf, or a serf and his lord, the issue was handled internally and not in the king's court. The aristocracy had no interest in peasant justice, so they passed along the power of the courts to lords, giving them power to operate their own manor court. It's probably no surprise that this was not exactly weighted in the serf's favor. If the issue being challenged was between the serf and the lord, be it a monetary dispute, alleged dicey work ethic, or unreasonable conditions for the serf, it was not likely that the judge, the lord accused, would rule against himself. This was a real bummer for serfs, since the lord also had the power to take generous liberties with their interpretation of the laws to curb it to their own favor. One of the 2 to 3 benefits of being a serf included having a place to live. Serfs usually lived alone or with their families, but serfs bunking with fellow random serfs like a dorm room was not common. Their housing varied from region to region, but the most common was a hut with a thatched roof or a roof comprised of dried vegetation, which sounds extremely safe. The hut itself was typically made of wood with 1 or 2 rooms and dirt floors. In the center of the hut was a hearth for cooking, complete with a state-of-the-art hole in the ceiling for smoke to ventilate. Unfortunately, this did not take into account the dried vegetation being used on the roof, famously flammable. So sure enough, these huts were known to catch on fire. While most people would see something like the Black Plague as something of a disadvantage to staying alive, serfs saw it as more of an opportunity to flee for a better life. During times of upheaval or societal chaos, of which there were many in the Middle Ages, some serfs would take advantage and quietly slip out into the night to towns far away from their lords, successfully leaving their serfdom behind. This decision did not come without risk. Serfs might have left when foot traffic was light in the streets of a plague-infected Europe, but that did not make them immune to catching the plague themselves. They were also vulnerable to attack since they were freely traveling without supervision, like a bunch of children let loose in a museum on a field trip. Where is that chaperone? Getting caught was probably the riskiest gamble, since punishment would be severe if captured and returned back to an angry lord in a now unkempt castle. The lord wasn't trying to plow his own fields or tend to his own chickens like some kind of grody poor person. Much like the movie The Irishman, serfdom took its time to come to an end. When and where serfdom came to an end, much like the plot of The Irishman, was all over the place. Normandy experienced a peasants' revolt in 996, which pretty much was a series wrap on serfdom in Normandy. England was soon to follow, a short little 385 years later in 1381, when their own peasants also said, "Screw this," and had their own uprising. The few stragglers that remained in the following century were free in 1574, when Queen Elizabeth I said, "This is nonsense," and formally abolished the practice of serfdom. Even so, a lot of places dragged their heels a bit in freeing their serfs, but for the most part, the widespread use of serfs was donezo by the end of the 14th century. A trickling of serf-like practices remained until the early 20th century in the UK under a copyhold tenancy holdover. Being a serf sucked, that much is pretty clear. But it also paved the way for some really ugly times in American history when early colonizers viewed this system as a way to receive free labor in the form of slavery. From the 14th century on, it was fairly understood that serfdom wasn't cool and fell out of favor when the New World was first colonized. Regions that were still using serfs for labor had the revelation they could make a killing overseas if they outsourced their labor. The servants they brought with them resembled a serf in that they were indentured servants who had the opportunity to pay for their freedom. But colonizers soon came to the monstrous conclusion they didn't have to offer a price for freedom if they imported free labor from Africa. Thus began a grim chapter in the American history books, where involuntary and lifelong slavery became the gold standard of labor. The heyday of the medieval executioner was in the 16th century, and when most people picture them, they tend to think of the stereotypical image of a burly, bare-chested man in a black hood with a massive axe. But the executioner did a lot more than just swing a blade. They upheld justice, set an example for the community, served as a medical professional, and often doubled as a spiritual guide who helped the condemned accept their fate and ask for forgiveness before God. How do we know? Thanks to Franz Schmidt, an axeman in 16th century Nuremberg who left detailed diaries describing his day-to-day life. Today, we're going to take a look at a day in the life of a medieval hatchet man. Okay, let's get into the head of Franz Schmidt. The masks may send shivers down the spines of regular folks, but your colleagues often wear them for good reason. On one hand, they terrify the prisoners, but they also concealed their identity and protected them from retribution. Something that's especially important in cases where the doomed person is sympathetic or popular with the crowd. You, however, are proud of your profession and have never worn the mask. Depending on the time or place of employment, a hangman might find themselves exceptionally busy, often dealing with several victims in a single day. For example, working under the reign of Henry VIII, you hardly had time to take a break. In times like that, the swordsman has their work cut out for them. Pun intended. But on August 13, 1577, you only have one job on the agenda, and the man's name is Hans Vogel. You only recently arrived in Nuremberg from your birthplace in Bamberg, and Hans Vogel is to be your first to hit the chopping block at your new gig. Vogel has been convicted of murder. Now, you will be expected to give him his just rewards. You came to this profession honestly. Your father passed down the profession back in Bamberg, although he didn't exactly mean to take that career path. Originally, he was a woodsman, but one fateful day, Bavarian magistrate Albrecht II, famous for his vicious disposition, wanted 3 men hanged. With no professional at hand, he picked your father, Heinrich, at random from a crowd and forced him to perform the deed. Not looking to join the 3 men, your father obliged the tyrant. Once it was done, though, nobody in the village wanted to have anything to do with your father. Despite this, you followed him into the occupation. It was 1573 when you first became a professional working under the supervision of your dad. You were 18, and since then, you've performed your duties 361 times. You've been busy. You've also administered 345 minor punishments, which include things like floggings as well as amputations of the ears and fingers. You've also taken out criminals by sword, rope, burning, drowning, and, in particularly bad cases, on the breaking wheel. You may not know what that is, but it just sounds painful, right? Despite all that and the generally dishonorable nature of your profession, you're a respected member of the community for your piety. You're the man who's going to be sending Hans Vogel to eternity, so you've gotten to know him. It's customary for an axeman to bond with a prisoner, and if he had serious wounds or had taken ill, you would, ironically, be the one expected to nurse him back to health, so that you could eventually execute him. Job security, I guess. In this sense, fulfilling your duties also requires being fully competent as a medical consultant. In such a case, you might even request a delay so the prisoner could receive a proper death with his health intact. Prisoners like Vogel would frequently receive visitors, such as their own family members or occasionally even the relatives of their victims, seeking reconciliation. You believe that forgiveness is divine. One time, you even saw a condemned killer offered oranges and gingerbread by his victim's widow, and it brought joy to your heart. You saw it as a sign she had forgiven him. But at the end of the day, your role is to mete out justice in the name of God and society. You're the agent who balances divine and earthly authority. And today, keeping that balance means ending Hans Vogel's time on Earth. While family or friends may visit occasionally, prisoners are most likely to be visited by members of the clergy. The chaplains meet with the prisoners, try to soften their hearts, and work to convince them to confess their sins and beg for God's forgiveness. They read aloud from the Bible, pray, preach, and appeal to the prisoners' fears, sorrows, and hopes. For images of what awaits them in the afterlife, prisoners often rely on the clergy to show them their illustrated prayer books. Most prisoners haven't seen much art in their lives. Small towns might have a church with rudimentary paintings on its walls, but many don't. Some might have caught a glimpse of heaven and hell in prints, but they were typically too expensive for the lower classes to own. even after the invention of the printing press. The chaplains who visit Vogel bring their prized Bibles and woodcuts, as well as etchings of famous sinners, famous saints, and death itself. They use the images to illustrate their sermons and bring life to the religious imagery. You often watch as the chaplains lead prisoners through a recitation of the Lord's Prayer, read from the Lutheran Catechism, and offer the condemned reassuring words. They sing hymns of consolation, and sometimes even the jailer joins in with the song. Everyone is quite sincere in their desire to get Vogel ready for his final day. When you became a professional life ender, you knew from your father that the job was about a lot more than just ridding the world of sinners. Taking someone out in public was intended to accomplish two distinct goals. The first is to shock the spectators. You are expected to create a terrifying scene that will have preventative power. Any who see it will think twice before committing an offense. The second goal, however, is more esoteric. As the hatchet man, it's your job to reaffirm both divine and human authority. You keep the balance by staging the act from condemnation through death procession all the way to the very end. It's like a play and you are the director. In fact, the people you know are all familiar with theatrical experiences called morality plays. These productions, which end with a moral lesson, are allegorical dramas in which characters personify moral qualities like charity or vice, and abstractions like death or youth. Similarly, the ending of a sinner also tells a story in which a person's choices led them to a moral lesson. A poor sinner sees the error of his ways. He acknowledges and atones for his crimes, and he agrees to serve as an example for the community in exchange for a quick, painless end and the promise of salvation. As everyone knows, the condemned may request whatever he wants for his final meal. This usually includes copious amounts of wine and beer, which is a little more than just a courtesy. It's no secret that letting a prisoner drink to their heart's content at the so-called hangman's meal is often to the executioner's advantage. You know as well as anyone that a drunk prisoner was often far less resistant. Of course, there are downsides. There was at one time when a condemned rogue ate and drank so much, you saw his belly burst as he swung from the gallows. Can't get that out of your mind. Maybe that's the reason some prisoners refuse to take so much as a single bite or sip. Vogel finishes his last meal. Your assistants help to dress him in the traditional white linen gown. Once dressed, he awaits you to preside over the imminent public spectacle. You are announced by the warden with the customary words, "The executioner is at hand." You take the stage and ask Vogel for forgiveness. The two of you share a drink of peace, and then you move on to the judge and jury who await the prisoner. Vogel has already confessed, but nonetheless, you must present him to the blood court, where his sentence will become known. The room is ornately decorated and the judges wear red and black robes. A scribe reads Vogel's confession and the tally of offenses against him. The jurors confer and choose the manner of demise. You wonder, will it be the sword, the rope, fire, water, or the wheel? The jurors voted, and they chose the sword. Meanwhile, the crowd has become enormous. These living morality plays are meant to be seen by as many as possible. They're advertised weeks in advance, and it's normal for there to be hundreds, sometimes even thousands of onlookers. Vogel must walk a mile to reach the place of his end. His trip goes smoothly, although that's not always the case. Sometimes prisoners behave badly or give you trouble. One drunken guy even urinated in the open when he reached the gallows. He told you he was willing to go on to the next world, but requested the chance to first fence and fight 4 of the guards who were present. As you wrote in your journal, his request was refused. Taking out a prisoner is never easy, but you're good at it. During your 45-year career, you have ended 187 people with a sword, and only 4 times did you need a second stroke. It's your responsibility to be that good. Being shoddy at this job has consequences. In some German towns, if the swordsman can't get the job done in 3 blows, the crowds were known to grab him and force him to take the place of the condemned prisoner. The crowds are typically packed with rowdy drunks, ready to riot at a moment's notice, especially if they don't see a head drop. And those riots often turn ugly, fast. When the moment arrives, you dispatch Vogel with one clean swipe of the blade. The judge expresses satisfaction with your work and you reply, For that, I thank God and my master, who has taught me such art. While the hard part is over, the job isn't quite done yet. You still have the mundane task of mopping up the mess. Yes, you are not only the star of the show, you're also the janitor, and you're expected to clean up the mess and dispose of the carcass. Out of curiosity, some of the mob lingers to watch. You don't know it yet, but in 1617, you'll retire and begin a new, lucrative career as a medical consultant. And in 1634, you'll receive a state funeral at Nuremberg's most prominent cemetery. You'll be buried just a few paces away from legendary artists like the painter Albrecht Dürer and the poet Hans Sachs. And you will have done it all without wearing a hood, even once. So what do you think? What kind of life would that be? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.